Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to give you guys a comparison between two different image editors, GIMP, the GNU image manipulation program. So both of these two programs are pretty competent, and you can download both of them for free, with the exception that Paint.net also has a paid version that you can pick up in the Windows Store. I think it was $7, but you can also just download it directly on Windows and install it normally, and that version is free. If you need a TLDR of which program is better, in my opinion, that would be GIMP. So let's go into some reasons for why that would be the case, why I prefer to still use GIMP. So inside of GIMP, you can save presets for effects. So I'm going to go ahead and add some random text to the screen here. So let's just call this test text. Now let's say that you want to use a drop shadow effect. So we can go up to filters inside of GIMP and then do shadow and go down to drop shadow. And you'll have a default drop shadow. It's kind of visible there. But what you can actually do once you've changed the settings is to save presets for effects like this. So for instance, I have a Chris Tutorials #1 preset, which has a much smaller shadow that has no blur radius. So the shadow ends up being an almost perfect black copy of whatever text is on front. And I think that just makes it easier to read and more clear for thumbnails and that sort of thing. So what you would do is just go ahead, mess with your settings, changing the values on them. You can also increase the opacity to make it more visible or decrease it to make it more subtle. And then you would come up here to save this. And then you would come up here to the top right and do save the current settings as a named preset, give it a name, and then it will appear in this menu for drop shadow or other effects. And you can always manage the saved presets in here to delete old ones that you no longer want. So other effects are going to have this same feature. So if we go to vignette instead, you can see presets here, the ability to save it and the ability to manage it. I think that's a pretty big deal, especially if you're going to be reusing a lot of the same effects again and again and again. And what I've seen, unfortunately, Paint.net doesn't have that. GIMP also has a lot more tools, effects, colored blend modes, and similar features than Paint.net has. Paint.net tends to be a little bit more simplistic, which is easier to get started with because you won't be overwhelmed by a lot of the tools that you just probably wouldn't use on a day-to-day basis. But if we go into Paint.net, for instance, you'll have the toolbox over here, and it's kind of what you see is what you get. But in current versions of GIMP, you can see that there's a little drop-down indicator for all of these menus. So when you actually look into it, GIMP just has a lot of tools that you can use for doing photo manipulation. So for that reason, GIMP ends up being more of a free version of Photoshop, and then Paint.net is like a vastly enhanced version of the default Microsoft Paint. It does have a lot more features, just not as much as GIMP. And of course, you can see that as well when you go into filters and you look at all the default effects. I haven't exactly counted, but you're definitely looking at dozens and dozens here. Whereas if you go to the Paint.net menu, there's a few in here, and there are some good ones, and they're quite easy to use, but just not as many. Okay, so another big one for anyone who's trying to be a bit artistic is that in GIMP you can actually have different paintbrush types. And strictly for the reason of doing digital art, I'm not sure I would use GIMP over another program like Krita, which is aimed more at artists. But if you go into paintbrush mode, you'll notice here that for a paintbrush, and also the pencil tool as well, you can come down here and see a reasonable selection of paintbrushes that you can use in GIMP. You may also notice dynamics here if you're using a drawing tablet. Using the different dynamics modes will give you a different look for using the same brush, depending on how hard you press on the drawing tablet or that sort of thing. So technically it is possible to add custom brushes inside of Paint.net as well. I've never personally really seen any paintbrush packs being made for Paint.net though, whereas I have seen some for GIMP. But at the very least, the lack of settings that you'll see over here for paintbrush mode in GIMP is kind of a killer if you're using Paint.net for anything but the most basic of paintbrush operations. Also in GIMP, your ability to customize gradients is a lot more than in Paint.net. So if I click on gradient mode in Paint.net, you can see that there are basic gradient types, linear gradients, reflected gradients, diamond, radial, so on and so forth. And they're pretty easy to use. You just select two colors that you want to transition between. You go between 2 points on your screen, and you can pretty quickly get a basic gradient. Also, it's quite responsive in its ability to update. And you can have your gradients on repeat, which is currently the setting. So if I go back to no repeat, then you only have one transition line for a linear gradient. But as far as I've seen, you can't actually take 3 or more colors and put that into a single gradient. So if we go over to GIMP and go into gradient mode, which is a drop down from the bucket fill, And now if we go ahead and click on the gradient selection menu, we can scroll down a bit and see that there are a lot of other options inside of GIMP. And one of the notable things about these is that you can have multiple points set for the gradient colors. So if I click on one like this abstract 3, and we go over to the gradient point image editor, you can see that in this gradient that many different colors have been set, including the position of their endpoints where the color should start to fade out and the next one should fade in. So you're able to get a bit more complicated inside of GIMP for that. And of course, as far as the gradient shapes go, you have more or less the same, plus maybe 1 or 2 extras here. So we can add our gradients in, just with a little bit extra control over how much we can say about what the gradient should look like. Now, one negative I can say about GIMP, having used it pretty extensively, is that at some times I can find it to be a little bit sluggish. One example of that is that if you have a lot of layers, including background images loaded up here into one GIMP document and you try to save it, it can take quite a bit of time in order to save. And of course this is going to vary, but some of the effects that you do find in here can take a bit of time in order to render. But honestly, these are mild annoyances at most, and I wouldn't make too big of a fuss about it. So now for some of the advantages of Paint.net. I find that the responsiveness of the program has a slight edge over GIMP. For instance, if we go down here to the layers box and add a new layer, then you'll see that there's a little animation for the layer popping up there rather than it just appearing in a single frame. If we go into the effects and try one of the effects out here, let's just throw an ink sketch there. You'll notice that it previews pretty quickly for what you're trying to do as well. So if we change any of the slider bar settings, you can see that it updates pretty quickly onto the screen. And so that ends up being a bit of a plus in terms of usability. Okay, also I would say that especially for beginners, some of the controls feel a little bit easier to use. For instance, if we come down here to this line curve tool, it's pretty easy to create a curve inside of Paint.net. So with the line curve tool, I'm going to left click and drag a line out. And you'll notice by default, it gives us 4 points for us to control. So if we want to make a curve, like a little U shape, then we only have to adjust these 4 points in order to do it. So I think that this is a little bit easier to look at and use for a beginner than something like the Bezier Curve Pen tool inside of GIMP. So if we go over to GIMP, we have something similar. So we can click on the pen tool and we would want to add a bunch of points. So I left click, add a point, left click, add another point. Now to create curves, we would want to left click on one of the lines over here. And as we drag it out, a Bezier curve handle is going to be created. So if we want to control the curve on both sides here, we're going to need to adjust both sides. So now we have one handle on each side, and we can pull these out and control them. So in the end, we can get pretty similar results. But I think the first couple times you use it, it's going to take a little bit more messing around with inside of GIMP. And so at least initially, it might be a little harder to use the tools in Paint.net if all you're trying to do is some basic stuff. Of course, that said, the tools in GIMP do go a little more advanced. They have more options available for them. For instance, in Paint.net, once you let go of your curve here, you can't really use it or edit it anymore. But in Paint.net, those curves get turned into a permanent path. So anytime you want to select this curve again, you can come over to paths. It's not actually part of the document currently. And then you could do something like stroke the path with a 6-pixel line, and then adjust it later so that you can use the same shape in a different place. So now we could stroke the path again. Stuff like that. So on a similar note, the text cannot be edited after placing inside of Paint.net. And obviously that goes for your curves too. There's not really a paths tool inside of Paint.net. This is really a big one actually. So if I try to add some text, the basic text tool is kind of nice because there's this little tool here for repositioning where your text is being written on. We can give it a text color, a text font. Okay, maybe something a little bit more serious. Let's try this. And now we can type some text onto the screen, right? Okay, and maybe we don't want it to be the multiple colors, so let's add it to a new layer, which you should do for text, so that if you need to make changes to the text, like remove it and adding it back in, that you can just delete that one layer that's specifically meant for text. So let's just add some text here. Tutorial of text, right? So while we're still in this editor interface, we can still move it. We can still delete the characters. But as soon as you let go, as soon as you left click out of that, this text is committed. It's now just part of the document, almost like a brush stroke. So you can, of course, go back in history to remove it which is nice, or you could just delete the layer altogether. But you can't left click on the text and then change the text. You can't left click on it and resize it. So once it's committed, it's basically done. Whereas in GIMP, the text tool is going to work a lot more like the paths tool, where you can always go back in and edit it. So I can write something here like tutorial text, and then I left click out of it. I can still go to the move tool. I can drag this element around. If we look in layers, this text is still its own layer. As long as it has this symbol, it's still text. As soon as you add something like drop shadow to it, you can see it's no longer text currently, but GIMP will still remember that it was originally text. So if you left click on it with the text tool, you can confirm text editing. It switches it back to a text layer, and that removes the effects that have been added since. But you can still now go back in, change it. Maybe we change the font color here to white with the color selection tool. And let's actually change the font size as well. So we'll make it 300. And so now without completely recreating the text, we can still go back in, add a drop shadow to the text. And that is pretty easy to do. Whereas in Paint.net, if we needed to do that, we would just simply need to delete the layer and then recreate it as a completely new text. So obviously there's a workaround for that, but it's pretty annoying. GIMP obviously gets an advantage in that regard. Okay, so now some good things about both of the programs. Both of them can save your images to an editable format that you can come back in and edit. So when you're gonna exit the program, you can go up to the file menu, do save as. In Paint.net, you have this .pdin format. So when you open that up inside of Paint.net, you're going to have the layers just like before. It won't be a completely exported image where everything gets condensed down into one layer. You can still come back in and edit it just as you were the first time you were working on your image. Of course, you still have the same limitations. So if you commit text, even if you save it and reload it, that text is still going to be uneditable. You still need to delete the layer for it. But at least you can work on it without having to completely restart the image. But the layers are still preserved, so you could still delete that text without needing to completely recreate the image from scratch. So likewise, in GIMP, you can go to File and then Save As, and it has its own format, .xcf. So you open that up, and then you can still do things like go back into your text layers, edit them. It's going to save the paths that you've created in this document. So it's pretty important that the image editors have that restorable format where you can continue working on your document. Also, both of them are Gimmick compatible. I just put out a video about how to install Gimmick for Paint.net, but it's also available inside of GIMP. So you'll notice in filters, I have Gimmick Qt here, which is the format of Gimmick that's applicable to most of the different free image editors out there, like Krita as well. So if you pop into this little interface, you can see that there's 548 effects that you can apply to your image documents, and that applies to Paint.net as well. You get the same number of filters in both of them, and that's really handy because you can see there aren't really all that many special effects here, so adding over 500 to both programs is a big deal. And it also helps Paint.net to keep up with GIMP in that regard. And then one really big thing for both programs, it's one of the reasons you wouldn't really use Microsoft Paint, aside from the most basic edits, is that you're working with layers in both programs. So when you use layers, you put your different edits into different layers, and then if you want to remove all of those edits, you just have to delete one layer. So if I want to remove all of this gradient stuff, I just delete the gradient layer, it's all gone. And then any of the other layers are still there, so they're preserved in the document when I need to make deletions. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the savable, editable formats. As long as you keep things in layers, you save it to those editable formats later on, then you can keep working on an image for a long time as long as you need to. So that's basically in a nutshell GIMP versus Paint.net. Both are pretty decent programs, but I think in the end I would give my edge to GIMP, especially for reasons like the text editor tool and paths in GIMP being able to be used and edited long term. As in, after you commit those changes and you move on to other edits, you can actually go back into the text and paths and edit them and reuse them in the future. So that's pretty much going to be it for this video comparing GIMP and Paint.net. I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in my future video content.